I guess one last thought we can throw out here is thoughts on expansion of All-Star. JJ mentioned it, I want to say approximately 47 times on his podcast about how he's campaigning for the league to
And he's done
expand
that for
rosters.
years. I think he
Yeah,
was saying that like 5-6 years ago. He was campaigning for that while he was still a player.
maybe. But I mean, with years like this, I would at least like to see them open up, I would say, like another slot in both conferences, if not two or three. There's so much more talent in the league today than there was across the board more than 10, 15 years ago. So, and he mentioned the percentage of players that are all stars compared to years past. Now that we have more roster spots, you have the two ways, those other available
Yeah.
slots, there's more players. So it used to be 20% or 10% of the league would be all stars. Now it's 5%. So the proportion is smaller just because the slots have not changed, the spots available, but the league size and uh, the number of worthy considerations in terms of like the number of players has gone up. So I wanted to throw it out there too. He makes some great points. I agree with him. I would like to see the roster expanded. I don't know about three in each conference, but I would say at least a couple more slots because we'll probably have more years like this where you have everybody healthy, and especially in the Western Conference, you're gonna have a lot of guys left off. I don't think it would dilute the award. That's why they brought up the
Yeah.
percentages because some people think it will dilute it. But like if the percentage, the proportion is the same today as it was in 1994 or whatever, when there were less players and definitely less players that were on
Playing
this
a heavy set
level,
of minutes, getting that sort of usage. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Then it doesn't really like destroy the case or just make All Star a handout because it's still a very small percentage of players and it's the same as it would be 20 or 30 years ago. So put that
I'd
out there.
probably expand it by one, especially with expansion on the horizon. Like there were talks that Adam Silver's new contract extension is partially based on the fact that he's supposed to usher in expansion. So
Mm-hmm.
that seems to indicate that by the time his next deal is finished, we will have 32 teams. So I feel like I'd get a jump start on that now, especially with the level of talent. I understand the reason kind of for keeping it the same because even if the total number of players who were probably eligible for All Star back then was smaller, those guys were also pioneers. They didn't have the advancements we've had in player development in terms of how coaches indicate players to play. Like, I always think of players like Reggie Miller, who back then were punished because um, just because of the style that existed back then and because of how people viewed players versus now, where we have so much more data on players, we're able to better understand them. Outside of local markets, we can watch players much more than we used to be able to. So I kind of understand the reason why um, it's been limited for so long. But I think now as we're heading towards expansion, we have more players who are capable of playing like all stars that don't get to showcase their opportunity on ball as much as we used to. Whereas back then, because there were fewer players who were at the caliber where they should be, those one-man shows, it was much easier to pick out all-stars versus now you'll have these super teams where it's like, well, Paul George is probably the third ball handler on his team, but he's been fantastic in the reps he does get, even though James Harden gets much more of the ball than he does. Same with
Mm-hmm.
Kawhi. So I think with that sort of dilution and the fact that All Stars become much more difficult now for those reasons, I think we could open up an extra spot. And as someone who was struggling between three players for two spots, yes, let's add a new spot right now, please.
Let's do it. Let's do it. Expansion is another reason for that. So if you
Yeah.
get two more teams, I actually would be in favor of even more than one. But for now, I think one would be a good place to start.